He listened with a strange look of surprise and pleasure rather than of pain, and replied that he had determined that very night to tell me that he had heard the Lord's call to Swatow, and that his one regret had been the severance of our happy fellowship. Arriving in Swatow, the two missionaries could find only a single room to rent over an incense shop in a crowded quarter of the city. When Captain Bowers visited them soon afterwards, he described their situation in a letter to a mutual friend back home. Seeking out his wretched lodging in Swatow, amongst the degraded of every class, I remarked, "Surely, Mr. Burns, you might find a better place to live." He laughingly told me that he was more content in the midst of this people than he would be at home surrounded by every comfort. He said his expenses amounted to $10 a month. "Mr. Burns," I exclaimed, "that would not keep me in cigars." He said it was sufficient for him. To William Burns and Hudson Taylor, $10 a month for a single room, even a room they had to enter through an opening in the floor, seemed like a bargain. But if it hadn't been for their inconspicuous Chinese dress, it is doubtful that they could have survived, let alone preach and make the friendships they did in that violent, hostile city. Europeans were suspect in Swatow because of the foreign involvement in the drug and slavery trade which plagued this corrupt city, and about which Hudson wrote to his family. About 200 boxes of opium are imported monthly. Each box contains 40 balls of about 40 pounds in weight. Thus, not less than 32,000 pounds weight of opium enter China every month at this port alone, the cost of which is about $250,000 sterling. After this, you will not be surprised to learn that the people are wretchedly poor, ignorant, and vicious. A cruel slave trade also is carried on under the name of the coolie traffic. The men are engaged, nominally, for a certain term of years, but few live to return. A bounty is paid them, and they are told they are going to make their fortunes, or they are entrapped by worse means. Once on the ship, the agent receives so much ahead for the poor fellows who soon find themselves in captivity of the most horrible kind. Some jump overboard in their efforts to escape, but they are generally retaken and flogged. Some ships carry 1,000 and others 300 or 400, and very many die before reaching their destination, Cuba, Havana, and Calla. Of one ship with several hundreds on board, I heard the surgeon say that not more than 2/3 would survive the voyage. Poor people. In a later letter to his sister, he wrote more about the conditions he saw around him. "If ever there was a place needing the blessings of the gospel, it is certainly this place. Men are sunk so low as to have lost all sense of shame, lower even than the beasts that perish. The official classes are as bad as the rest, and instead of restraint, you will not be surprised to learn that the people are wretchedly poor, ignorant, and vicious." A cruel slave trade also is carried on under the name of the coolie traffic. The men are engaged, nominally, for a certain term of years, but few live to return. A bounty is paid them, and they are told they are going to make their fortunes, or they are entrapped by worse means. Once on the ship, the agent receives so much ahead for the poor fellows who soon find themselves in captivity of the most horrible kind. Some jump overboard in their efforts to escape, but they are generally retaken and flogged. Some ships carry 1,000 and others 300 or 400, and very many die before reaching their destination, Cuba, Havana, and Calla. Of one ship with several hundreds on board, I heard the surgeon say that not more than 2/3 would survive the voyage. Poor people. In a later letter to his sister, he wrote more about the conditions he saw around him. "If ever there was a place needing the blessings of the gospel, it is certainly this place. Men are sunk so low as to have lost all sense of shame, lower even than the beasts that perish. The official classes are as bad as the rest, and instead of restraining evil, are governed themselves by opium and love of money. And if it be possible to live worse lives than the heathen, then the sailors and other foreigners who frequent Double Island do so. Sin does indeed reign here, and as always those most to be pitied and whose case seems most helpless are the women. However low men seek in heathen lands, women seek lower. Looked upon as hardly having any soul, girls are sold here for wives or slaves and are left entirely without education. Married women and families are not numerous in proportion to the population, but the number of unfortunate women is great. I say unfortunate advisedly, for they are bought and brought up for this very purpose. They are the absolute property of their owners, and have no escape from that which many of them abhor. Only a few nights ago I was distressed by heart-rending screams from 2 female voices, and on inquiry was told that they were most likely newly bought women in a house nearby who were being tortured into submission. And that, added my informant, is very common here. The cries went on for about 2 hours. Poor things. This is hardly a fit subject to write to you about, but unless you know, how can you pity and pray for them? English women little realize all they owe to the gospel. It was in such a setting that Hudson Taylor and William Burns not only lived and survived, but saw such heartening response to their message, and made so many friends that they were able, after only 4 months, to rent an entire house that would serve as the headquarters of their growing ministry. It was at this point that the older missionary convinced Hudson to return to Shanghai for his medical supplies in order that they could open up a hospital as part of their work in Suttow. Hudson went, but only reluctantly. He hated to leave the older man alone to face the oppressive heat and accompanying diseases of summer as much as he dreaded the temporary end of the companionships that had come to mean so much to him. He recalled the time later, saying, "Those happy months were an unspeakable joy and comfort to me. Never had I had such a spiritual father as Mr. Burns. Never did I know such holy, happy friendship. His love for the Word was delightful, and his holy, reverential life and constant communing with God made fellowship with him to satisfy the deep cravings of my heart." But Hudson did indeed sail for Shanghai, where he made the disheartening discovery that all his medical supplies had been destroyed by fire. And before he could replace them and return to Suttow, he received the even more distressing news that William Burns had been arrested by the corrupt Chinese authorities in Suttow and sent under escort on the harsh 31-day journey to Canton. Hudson himself was forbidden to return to Suttow. Suddenly, the path that had seemed so clear before him was again blocked. And yet it was this latest obstacle in his life's journey that sent him on a detour that he would never once regret. This brings us to the years of 1856 through 1858. Over the political horizon, storm clouds had been gathering for many months. Now the very mail that brought tidings of William Burns' arrest told also of the outbreak of hostilities between England and China. Hudson had traveled to see Dr. Parker in Ningpo in hopes that he might have some extra medical supplies from which he could replenish his lost equipment. So it was at Ningpo that there came word of the bombardment of Canton by the British fleet, and the start of the war between China and England, which was not to end until 4 years later. On hearing about the news of war, Hudson's first concern naturally was for William Burns. He was, fortunately, no longer at Swatow, exposed to the rage of the hot-headed southern people. About all this, Hudson wrote his sister in November. "As you are aware, I have been detained in Ningpo by various circumstances, and a sufficient cause has at length appeared in the disturbances which have broken out in the south. The latest news we now have is that Canton has been bombarded for 2 days, a breach being made on the 2nd, and that the British entered the city, the Viceroy refusing to give any satisfaction. We are anxiously awaiting later and fuller accounts. I know not the merits of the present course of action, and therefore refrain from writing my thoughts about it. But I would just refer to the goodness of God in removing Mr. Burns from Suttow in time. For if one may judge of the feelings of the Cantonese in Suttow by what one sees here at present, it would go hard with anyone at their mercy. So, once again, something that seemed a great calamity one minute was soon seen to be included in the all things that the Apostle Paul said work together for good for them that love God. And that was a lesson reinforced all the more by yet another development during Hudson's unplanned detention in Ningpo. In the southern section of the city, near the ancient pagoda, was a quiet street named Bridge Street, between two lakes. There, Hudson's old friend and former colleague, Dr. Parker, had opened a dispensary a mile or two from his hospital. It was there, as autumn was advancing, that Hudson Taylor happily found a temporary home. Looking back on those days, he wrote, "I have a distinct remembrance of tracing my initials on the snow which during the night had collected on my coverlet in the large barn-like upper room. The tiling of a Chinese house may keep off the rain, if it happens to be sound, but does not afford so good protection against snow, which will beat up through the crannies and crevices and find its way within. But however unfurnished may have been its fittings, the little house was well adapted for work among the people, and there I thankfully settled, finding ample scope for service, morning, noon, and night." The only other foreigners in that part of the city were Mr. and Mrs. J. Jones, also of the Chinese Evangelization Society, and Miss Aldersey, who, with the help of two young English sisters, was running a surprisingly successful school for girls, the first ever opened in China. The sisters were the orphan daughters of the Reverend Samuel Dyer, one of the earliest missionaries to China. When the Jones family had come to live not far from the school, the younger of the sisters, Marie Dyer, found many opportunities to help out and befriend the busy young mother. Whenever she could, Maria went out with the Jones to do neighborhood evangelism, her fluency in the language providing a big help. Though she was not yet 20, this bright, gifted girl had the heart of an evangelist. That was no doubt one of the things about Maria that attracted Hudson Taylor's interest. For in the home of his fellow workers he couldn't help but encounter Marie Dyer from time to time, and he soon found that he couldn't help but think of her even when he didn't encounter her. She had such a warm and open manner that the two young people soon became good friends, and before long she began to fill a place in his heart that had never been filled before. But before he was willing to admit his feelings, even to himself, outside circumstances interrupted their blossoming friendship. A plot to massacre all foreigners was discovered. Though the plan was thwarted, hostility among the region's Cantonese population toward the British was so widespread that the foreign community couldn't afford to ignore the danger. So it was decided that families with children would be sent to Shanghai, the port with the most secure foreign settlement. Hudson's familiarity with the Shanghai dialect made him the most logical escort for the party. As much as he hated to leave, he couldn't very well refuse the unwanted assignment. Miss Aldersey could not be persuaded to leave Ningpo. Nearing retirement age, she was in the process of turning the management of her school over to the American Presbyterian Mission and didn't want any additional unnecessary disruptions. So, taking what precautions were possible, she encouraged the Dyer sisters to remain in Ningpo with her. And since Maria's sister had just become engaged to his own special friend J.S. Burden, Hudson worried that Maria would feel all the more alone and unprotected. Yet, before he left for Shanghai, Hudson said nothing to Maria, or to anyone else, about his growing affection. Indeed, he tried to deny it, for he had no reason to believe that she felt the same way about him, and he wasn't anxious to have his heart broken again. In addition, his time in China had showed him the kind of sacrifices required to carry out his call to evangelize the interior, and he had begun to realize lately how little security he had to offer a wife. His position with the Chinese Evangelization Society was becoming more and more embarrassing. For some time he had known that the society was in debt, and that his salary was being paid from borrowed funds. Recalling the circumstances, he later wrote, "Personally, I had always avoided debt, though at times only by very careful economy.